Oh, I'm awake. I'm awake. I'm here. Welcome, everyone. I'm just getting up here, making a video. I just made a video previously, and I did not have my microphone accurately connected, and so it didn't have sound. So this time, it's working! Okay, it's great to be with you, and I am recording this video on personality attributes and functions to share with you. It's just like, I felt like it was kind of important to include some of this material in the 16 weeks, even though it's, coming to an end. If you feel called to watch this video, I hope that there are some nuggets in there that are of interest to you and help you on your path. Okay, so this video is going to be about a little bit of some history of 3 personality type models. Going to actually go a little bit into some of the terms of these different models, so it's a little bit of a deeper understanding maybe than some of the earlier videos that I put out, although not super deep. It's okay if it's just enough, and just enough to invoke your curiosity. And for you to then follow that, because the curiosity is what it brings life, brings the motivation to learn and to grow. Okay, we'll be hopefully pointing out some areas where these models actually encourage growing compassion and understanding. And I'll share some comments about polarities and trinities. So I'm going to start talking about Carl Jung's personality type model first. And Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist and physician who founded analytical psychology. And he was treating patients in a hospital. So these were patients that had pretty extreme cases, and so he studied his patients, and in 1921 he actually published his personality type model. And by no means was personality types like the focus or a super main focus of his work. It was definitely an important part of his work, but he proposed this model as a way of really like a hypothetical model that could help with his clinical practice. He wanted to actually be able to help people, and so his focus was not on like research and going in collecting data and substantiating this model. His purpose was to actually work with people and to increase his understanding and inform the techniques that he could maybe use to help people with their journeys. His personality type model, he actually said that a personality type was kind of a natural set of inclinations that a person was born into this world with, and that it was composed of functions. And there are 2 main types of functions: perceiving functions and judging functions. The perceiving functions are the functions that allow you to take information in, to basically have awareness of something, and the judging functions allow a person to make choices, make judgments. And in his model, he set forth the perceiving functions, two main types of perceiving functions: sensation or sensing, and intuition. And I kind of described these somewhat. I'm not gonna maybe get super detailed on this, but you can see here that he set forth these perceiving functions and then combined them with the introverted and extroverted, he called it attitudes, to create a possibility of 4 total perceiving functions. There's also a total of 4 judging functions that he named. The 2 main types being feeling and thinking, and each of those can be combined with the introverted and extroverted attitude. So in total, this gave a total of these 8 total functions that the personality can be comprised of, and he had certain thoughts about how those functions were involved in comprising this personality type. So before I get too much into that, we'll talk a little bit more about introversion and extroversion, the attitudes that he described. And they have to do with how the subject, the self, relates or perceives its object. And so there's 2 ways you can do this, and the introverted and extroverted attitudes, they were really applied to specific functions. And because Jung's model, we're going to get into this, he suggested that a person has one single dominant function, and the attitude associated with that dominant function was kind of like, in his model, the preferred style, in a way, this preferred attitude of the person, either introverted or extroverted. But in some way, these introverted and extroverted attitudes are applied to functions, and he also said in his model that every person, has some degree of the ability to do introverted or extroverted functions. Although in his model, we'll see here, he had a view that most of them are unconscious. But so Jung's extroverted term, it wasn't like, oh, extroverts love parties. It had to do with when the self is predominantly outwardly directed, always looking to the outside world, and in a way then when it's maybe noticing what's in the outside world, it's a little bit more, I want to say, matter of fact, and less subjectively colored or biased or interpreted or filtered. So contrasted with the introverted attitude, and it's like some generality which says introverts don't like parties. That's not like a rule or something, but rather the subject, the self, kind of like is in an introverted attitude would be more actively filtering the outside object through some sort of subjective lens that colors the object more so, and so that has a different, like, inward flavor to it. So these personality rules, in Jung's system, he proposed that there's one conscious, he used the word conscious and unconscious. These terms, Jung is just so influential in so much of the modern psychological discourse that we have today, and some of this stuff is even so commonly talked about that it almost just seems normal, ubiquitous, and also Jung's writings are so extensive that to actually go down the road to study how much he wrote, and it would be many years to digest all of that material. So it's kind of this, it's so interesting how much of it has made it into the popular lexicon. But so anyway, in his model, the personality type rules, he set forth this idea that of those 8 functions, every person has one dominant preferred one, and in his view, all of the other ones that the person had access to were relatively unconscious. And so for him, it was like always something that was, these unconscious functions were less developed. He used words like more archaic. He would use like in their expression, or inferior as a term that he would use. So it's just kind of denoting this quality of a little bit like under less, like, he would use the term conscious choice. It would be something that's more automatic. It would be more of like a triggered state. You could look at it maybe like that. So again, to really get the nuances of what he was talking about when he uses the word conscious and unconscious, there's a whole lot of nuance there, which I'm not going to attempt to go into it at this point. But I will point out that this is just a model, and it's really fascinating to consider, you know, using his model, what type of a person would come up with a model like this? What type of a personality would come up with a model like this that would view a personality with one conscious dominant function and all others are unconscious? And in a way, I kind of had such a chuckle when I was thinking about this, because it's like in one of the other personality model systems, they're suggesting, and when I read Jung, I think too, like his dominant function was probably his introverted thinking function. So he's constantly doing introverted, this very subjective, introspective type of thinking. It does go to the outside world, but then it filters and processes it so much in the thinking, with the thinking function. And that thinking function, which we all think, it's like we all think we know what that is, but that thinking function is the one that came out and said, well, clearly all those other functions are totally unconscious. It's like, in a way, maybe it says a little something about his inner experience. And yeah, I just had a chuckle about that. So he had some certain rules about what functions, based on the dominant one, that you could have like a kind of a helper function or an auxiliary function that didn't really compete so much with the dominant function. Because if there was a dominant function that was a, like say, introverted feeling, a judging function in his model, if you had another judging function, like a thinking function, that was the auxiliary, the number 2 function, there would be too much conflict between feeling and thinking, because those actually form more of a polarity, more of this way of making decisions that is a little bit diametrically opposed, a little bit kind of has a little bit of a tension between the two styles of making decisions. And so in his model, he suggested that would be too much like inner conflict in a way. So a person's auxiliary function would, if they had a dominant judging function, their auxiliary function would be a perceiving function, and it would also have the opposite attitude. And so if you had an introverted dominant function, you would have an extroverted auxiliary function. So he had rules like this in his system, but Jung was really actually very clear in his system that he presented this as a hypothetical model, and in a way he really set forth that there were the 8 main functions that were dominant, and the unconscious ones, in a way, you didn't have to get into so much what they were, because they were all unconscious in his view. He said more or less, it wasn't necessarily as black and white as that, because he did say people are a complex tapestry of so much, their inclinations, but all their life experience. And so having a person that was like a pure dominant version of an introverted thinker was just a hypothetical possibility that in some way having maybe a little bit of a model and understanding might help him with his clinical practice, but it was definitely not something that he was expecting to like test a subject on and come to some scientifically provable personality type. That wasn't how Jung was putting this particular model out there. And he went on, again, his career was very prolific and touched on so many different areas. And he went on to, and was at the same time working on, the personality theory. He was, and continued to develop his archetypes model and write extensively about them as well. And so the personality archetypes, I wanted to bring this up because it's like, in a way, it's another way of kind of like combining some different properties or aspects of a personality that Jung had come up with in his system. And he had noticed the overlap in the stories and the extreme states that people would have, and how they kind of mapped or seemed eerily familiar, even in the nighttime dreams or the stories or the delusions that his patients would have. He would notice the themes that were so similar to the mythology that he had read so extensively. So he kind of put together this archetype model as well. So it's a little bit more like these different characters that you can look at as the personality, which is more of a more fully woven together, formed version of how the behaviors can combine into a more formed personality, rather than the personality functions themselves, like at the much more split down, reduced qualities that make up the personality. So there's, even this person, Jung created multiple models, in a way you could say, for the personality. Catherine Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers were independently studying personality and coming up with their own system. And in 1921, though, they read Jung's work and were influenced by it pretty highly, and ended up integrating a lot of Jung's work into their system. And they were working on creating this thing called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Their goal was to be able to actually more scientifically prove or determine what a person's personality type was. So the idea that we have kind of an initial type or inclination was something that seemed pretty plausible to them, and they wanted to actually try to collect some data and show that that was the case. And they did this using self-questionnaires. They defined a whole system for their personality type model, and they said, everyone can do all of these 8 functions, but everyone has the top most preferred. Jung actually did write about this too, the top 4 functions. But again, that dominant function was like, that's a really important part that's going to drive things, was like his view. And the MBTI system got more into the nuances of how those auxiliary functions were interacting to create the wholeness of the expression of the personality. And sometimes they would refer to this as a stack of functions. So MBTI, you've probably maybe heard about this too. There's a lot of memes out there on the internet about the 16 types. So these types are formed, they track these kind of binary qualities that a person has with their specific definitions for what these terms mean. So they don't mean exactly the same thing from one system to the other. They're all just models and different ways that people have viewing things. But they came up with these 16 different models of their different rules, and it's interesting, to read about. But both Jung and the MBTI model have come under a lot of criticism. The MBTI, because even though they wanted to be scientific, the fact that they used these self tests it just seems like a lot of the criticism is that it is easy for the person to basically be very biased in how they answer the tests. And it's like unclear about whether the questions are really going to capture and test for the trait that the system, the indicator, is trying to test for. So they get criticism about that, basically saying it's not really objective, it actually is subjective, it's not really scientific. And then get lots of criticism that it's reductionistic, like looking at a person like a set of functions is very, it's oversimplified, right? People are very complex. So much more recently, there is a couple based out of Portland, Oregon, who decided they were going to try to do personality typing, but try again to do it more objectively. And with their approach was, rather than to try to test a person using some sort of a self-test, they were going to have analysts basically observe the person who's being tested. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to see if two independent observers would get the same type for the person that they were observing. And so in order to do this, everyone have to know exactly what are the terms that or traits that we are tracking, and get really clear on those definitions. And then if they could do a sample of hundreds of people, and the two pairs of analysts most of the time choose the same type, that would mean that there might actually be some sort of validity to their work, especially if, when in their system they have 512 options. So if you like, the statistical probability of getting the same type 1 out of 512 possibilities for many samples, like test subjects, that's astronomically small that you would be able to do that by chance. So if they're able to really do this over and over and repeat it, then it starts to strengthen this hypothesis that they're putting forth out there in their system. And in their system, I'll get into the terms, but it does build on those functions that Jung set out, but includes functions that they have added to the system too. And something that's really cool with their system is, since this is the modern day and age, there's all this video of so many people available online doing video logs and all these interviews. And with the video, the medium, and being able to pause, replay, study, it's like it is, it's kind of added a whole nother layer of this powerful tool of study that it just wasn't available 100 years ago. So this has been interesting to kind of watch this unfold. So in the objective personality, abbreviated OP, they talk about observer functions, which are based on Jung's perceiving functions. And they don't actually have a really specific definition of what these functions are. They're really based on Jung's function, but they focus more on how to notice them as an analyst. So they don't really have a super clear, written definition of what the sensing function actually is. They write a little bit more about what it does. So sensing, I decided I was going to take a stab at defining how I'm understanding what the definition is from the objective personality system. And what I see is that it seems like they're saying sensing takes in and processes raw sensory data from the physical body and the outside world. And sensing senses real and imagined sight, sound, smells, taste, touch, pressure, and movement. It looks for provable facts, tracks details, data, statistics, and sees the current situation. Sensing senses who, what, where, when. And these observer functions are they're more of a polarity. These are kind of two somewhat opposing ways of observing. Intuition is like imagination. It looks for abstract connections. It discovers why things are connected using abstract groups, patterns, and analogies. It guesses what could be. Intuition intuits what if, why, how, maybe this. And the objective personality decider functions, they're based on Jung's perceiving functions. The decider functions help a person to make a decision in a way that prioritizes either the self first or the tribe first. And we can, obviously, every person can prioritize and make decisions in both of those ways. So this is, again, also in their system, more about what is a person's default way of being or their preferred way of prioritizing. So they're looking for that. And then the way that I kind of tried to formulate a definition for what the feeling function is and combined with what it does here. Feeling tracks and prioritizes emotional feelings, emotional tone, vibes, and the spectrum of pleasure and pain, attraction and repulsion. Feeling feels energetic vibrations as a felt sense. Thinking tracks and prioritizes language-based reasons, makes definitions, uses logical operators like if this, then that, puzzles, analyzes, is concerned with what works, what makes logical sense. Thinking thinks, this is true as a cognitive process. So what I'm saying, all these little functions and everything, what's coming up for me right now is like, there's so much kind of like overlap. It's hard to pull it apart and make a real clear like decider function to say like, this is that, because there's so much like, they're happening either all at the same time or they're somehow connected. It's like, if you're thinking about something, you probably sensed it, going into some thought. You maybe had a sensation and then a thought happened that was very connected to that sensation. And if you had a feeling, there could have been some sort of sensation that came up in your body that you were noticing. And like emotional feelings versus, it's just like it's a little hard to get a grasp about what these terms are when you just start getting introduced to them and after you've been working with them for a while. So in the objective personality, introversion and extroversion are they're using kind of this same term, they're using the same general flavor that Jung used in his system, but they're doing something a little different in that they're talking about how it is more like defining a spectrum, which is I think it's a useful way of talking about it, just because the word introverted and extroverted are so easy, or even ambivert, are hard to quantify out there when you're just casually talking. So like the spectrum thing is helpful to talk about, like, do you have a narrow focus, more of an introverted focus, or do you have more of a broad focus, more of an extroverted focus? And so the narrow and broad, though, still it doesn't really exist in and of itself. You have to apply it to a function, and then it starts to become more meaningful. So with the observer functions, if you are narrowing down what you're observing, you're actually doing a behavior that's more like organizing. Or if you're broadening what it is that you're observing, you might be doing a behavior in the world like gathering. And then with deciding functions, if you are making a decision and you're narrowing something down, well, we're narrowing it down, this decision, to the way that this narrows it down is that you narrow it down to yourself, is like what you're prioritizing. You're prioritizing your decision based on yourself, or a narrower set, maybe your family. It's like you're narrowing it down. Or you could be broadening your decision making process and considering a whole bunch of people. And so knowing these terms and then starting to know like what are the preferences or the default ways of taking in information or being aware of things, and the default ways of making decisions in the world. So it's pretty difficult in a way, and understandable, the criticism that there is of Jung, in that it can be like, oh, it's too reductionistic. We're not just programs of these individual functions. So the objective personality system they came up with this animals as something that they're tracking, a coin that they're tracking in their system. And what this is doing is, it's because it can be difficult to notice the really finely granular personality functions, feeling, thinking. It's like you don't really see just feeling or just thinking or just sensation or just intuition at a time when you're watching another person, or when an analyst is looking at another person, or when you're trying to analyze yourself or understand yourself. It's like there's so much going on that it's difficult to like reduce it down to just one function. But sometimes you can look for the interaction of two functions, and then you can infer what the two functions are underneath. It's almost like if you had a swimming pool of balls, red balls and blue balls, and you had a whole bunch in there, and there's a drone that you fly way up overhead, and the drone looks down at the swimming pool from way at a distance, and it sees a purple swimming pool. And then there's a question, which is like, well, there's a swimming pool, there's a pool down there, it's got balls, and there's two colors. What two colors do you think are in that swimming pool? If you look at the drone images, then you might guess something like, oh, red and blue. So this is what the animals are doing. They're combining one observer and one decider. And the objective personality system has some really specific ways about, like, rules also about how these different traits can be combined in a personality. I'm not going to share all those details, but the BLAST will combine a person's introverted observer and a person's extroverted decider. So this is like, okay, what have I narrowed down on, and what am I aware of? What have I learned? What have I organized? Let me take that and extrovertedly somehow share this with the tribe, or do something with this. So BLAST is like a teaching thing, or maybe creating something in the external world that you've already processed internally in some way. And then consume as a behavior is, well, it's consume. They're nice terms because they're a little bit more easy to understand in terms of a behavior, maybe. So consume is going to the outside world, and extrovertedly, like, becoming aware of something, taking in something new, and you're taking it in for yourself. Consuming food, new information, news, learning things. That would be consume. Then they have another binary coin of sleep versus play. And sleep is an introverted, kind of like going in, narrowing down on all the things that you're aware of, organizing your thoughts or what you're learning, and you're doing it just for yourself, by yourself. Play would be more like going out into the world and going out with other people, playing in the world or doing things, exploring the world together. So that's sleep versus play. And again, this is kind of another polarity that you can kind of look at yourself and just puzzle a little bit and observe yourself and wonder, which one are you preferring, or do you do more of? And is there a benefit to maybe doing a little more of the thing that you're not doing as much of? Or is it hard for you to do one of these things? And would you like to learn how to do that thing better? Are you doing something so much that you're actually addicted to it, and you have actual issues if you don't get enough of that? You have some sort of like withdrawal from doing the thing that you're the animal that you're kind of addicted to. So there's a lot of considerations that you can look at when you start to see these really basic coins that they have in their system as a model. They also track a coin called the sexuals, and this has to do with like the masculine and the feminine in their system are kind of like attributes or little tags that they apply to every single function. And a masculine kind of sexual quality has to do with something being non-movable, and the feminine quality has to do with something being movable. And so you have to apply it again to a particular function. So like a masculine sensory function would be a person who's very non-movable with their, say, like their facts or their data. They might have a really, really awesome physical memory for dates and times and like all these details. That's very masculine sensor. A feminine sensor might be very flexible with their facts. Like, facts are not as important for me to go along with something. Maybe facts are a little harder for me to even remember because I'm a little more movable with my sensor. But so the sexual coin, when they were studying this, they started to find that there was a little bit of a pattern in terms of how different people seem to actually experience the world based on what is kind of this movable quality and non-movable quality with these different functions, which is kind of surprising and very interesting too. A specific example of this is they're finding that a person's inner experience or like kind of like their dominant sensory function in a way is often it seems like it falls along the pattern of the functions that a person seems like they prefer. And so say for example a person might be more of like an audio person, and their inner experience, say for example when they read, they may read and hear a voice as they're reading, compared to a person who's a little bit more visual or who is visual, and in their experience they may not actually hear the words when they're reading, but just more absorb the information as they read, not really audibly though. And when they started questioning people about the different internal experiences and how they learn, how they read, how they're just the information that's actually registering on their bodies, it's like people are really literally having very different internal experiences, and we don't often talk about this or know that this is happening. And it is pretty amazing to start to realize this because it really just opens up to understand different people's experiences are so different, and that it may really be necessary to communicate in different ways to make sure that you're reaching and connecting with people who have different they're called modalities is how they talk about them in their system. So with their system, again, trying to make it objective, once they started collecting a lot of data, what was interesting about it was the people, again, one of 512, there's 512 types, so it's much more than Jung's system, 16 with the MBTI, 512. Well, once they had enough people, say, all the people who would show up with one particular type, they started noticing a pattern of, in a way, how similar oftentimes the people of the same type would look. And it's kind of just uncanny. They don't use this as a way of typing people. It just so happened that they would notice some of the similarities. So this slide, I tried to kind of pick some that showed this. You can kind of see the similar look to people who have the same type or very similar type. So how is this useful? I wanted to talk first about, all of these different coins and all of these things. They're bringing up polarities, and it can just be helpful sometimes to simplify things, to try to create more clarity, just make things more different, create when you're looking at yourself and you're looking at a problem that you're struggling with, if you can find some sort of a polarity about the thing that's really hard and you don't like, what's the opposite thing that you really would like? Like find what that polarity is of the thing that's creating tension in your life and study that. And when you have that clarity about it and you study it and you start working with the different qualities, you start to realize at some point that when you learn that you have a lopsidedness in the polarity, you have an opportunity. It's a good thing in a way, because you can look at it as an opportunity if you choose to make it something positive. You can. When you start to learn more and more about that thing that was actually a little maybe challenging for you, you can start to play with having some fluidity and flexibility to actually find something positive in that thing that was hard for you or that was giving you a problem before. And so this just opens up possibilities in your life. Maybe it's the feeling and the thinking polarity, and something was a little bit more challenging. I have more problems with feeling a lot of times. So it's like work on that, try to work on that, and get a little bit more, just well-versed and able to deal with it. It's like, oh, great, this is great. But then not only can you start to use one or the other, but sometimes they can start to become like, oh, they can actually get really flexible, and I can switch back and forth between them pretty quickly. I can use them so quickly that I'm almost using them together or balanced at the same time. And then maybe they start to combine, and instead of really being a polarity of two different things, some new thing actually gets created. This is like the idea of the Trinity. It's not so much of a polarity, but there is some sort of a Trinity. Once you start working with the polarity, something new can emerge. And that makes it a Trinity. And with the triplex training, I do like to also mention unity, because to me it doesn't seem complete to talk about just even as a Trinity, because if you have these two different qualities that you're working with, sometimes they combine into this third new thing, but then also sometimes they're one, you're at the one end of the polarity, but then you have like little traces of its opposite inside. We learned with the brainwave portion of the training, we talked about how there's that phenomena of coupling. When you have a super slow brainwave and you zoom way in on it, there can be a super fast brainwave that's riding on that super slow brainwave, and vice versa. A super fast one can have a super slow wave at a very small zoomed in level. So it's like this, just like the wonder of life, and how so much can be happening on all these different levels at the same time. And within your personality, that can happen too, because your personality is life. So whatever the quality is that's challenging to you, or where you're wanting to grow, or where you just are growing because it's a natural part of your process, it's how beautiful to see the unfolding of the relationship of the polarities. So noticing that, and it brings you to relationship. And yeah, it brings you to a relationship. So again, I want to talk a little bit more about the another polarity, the relationship, similarity and diversity. I want to say something about polarities. Just anytime you contrast something, you can get a sense for this, and you can see and you can use it as something positive. Something positive about similarity with regard to this personality stuff. All these personality models are just models. Like, I can think, like, right now, another model that you could put out there would be like, oh, there's 8 personality functions, and you know, these models pretty much say that a person either has 1 dominant, or they'll say that you have 4. Those other 2, the MBTI and the objective personality, say that you have 4 functions. You could also say something like you have 1 dominant function that's usually so dominant that it's pretty obvious. You have also 1 function that's usually pretty opposite of that dominant one, that's usually pretty weak. But then you actually can do everything. You actually have 8 functions. That's a given. And it's so difficult to parse them out because there's so much life there. All the ones that are in the middle, the 6 others in the middle, you can't put them in order. It would be too difficult. It's like almost like an intractable problem. But we can approximate it with this model and just saying that it's 4 and simplify it and go with that. Anyway, so there's a whole nother model for you right there. There's a whole bunch of others. I think the big 5 has been pretty popular here lately, and also being very researched, and there's so many models. Look up more models. But the utility of that, the usefulness, is that if you do understand some of these models, you can try to know yourself, and you can try to know other people who have a similar or the same type. Because if you find those people, and those people are doing really well, or who have learned to overcome the challenges that they have in their lives, which might be very similar to the problems that you have in your life, then you found some role models who really might be able to help you. I don't know if you tried to learn, sometimes you can go try to learn something from a master of anything, whatever it is, cooking, and maybe they were just really naturally gifted at that. They didn't really have to learn how to do it so much. They just knew it was their natural inclination. You can have someone trying to share with you how to do what it is they naturally do, or you can go to a person to try to learn what it is that they're doing that they had no idea how to do it before. They were totally clueless, but somehow they learned to do it and they became a master. It's like if they probably had to really learn how to overcome something in order to get where they got. So if you can find a person who has to overcome the same big life challenges that your personality inclination blessed you with at birth, that could be really cool. There's also going to be so much literature out there when people are studying these different types as a system to see the patterns that they see, and that can give you an opportunity to ask yourself, hey, do I have this pattern? So that can increase your awareness. So diversity, the spectrum awareness, if you look at diversity, again, the whole diversity of people, how different all of our experiences are. It's truly amazing. And to really understand that and take that in, and to appreciate how our differences are really supporting all of us together, and how we're able to organize and live together. And to have compassion, appreciate and each other, and also have compassion for our differences, and to help us to be able to communicate with one another better, and to be compassionate and understand in a way, like, if we do really have, say, these 8 dominant functions, and that means that we maybe all have these 8 different possible functions that are kind of less developed, that we were less inclined, say, to use those functions. That means everyone has one function that they're less inclined to use, and they're maybe not quite, they not quite as good at doing that one, or maybe they've learned to, but when they were born, maybe they weren't so good at doing that 8th function or 4th, whatever your model is, their least developed one. But yeah, think about like how compassionate you could feel if you really just, yeah, if you just take that in, and it's like it create this view of like understanding too, like the differences in those functions, and like, oh wow, like if my last function is sensing, and I think about what my problems are, but then somebody else is, it's hard for me to somehow relate to this person, but their last function is something different from mine. But I could really appreciate knowing how hard mine is, that their struggle is probably equally as hard, but just in a different way. So I think it also really helps to just think about this, to project less. Our experiences really are very different, I think. I just feel like this is what I see out there. And these models seem to be tracking this too. So yeah, less projection, more reception. So we're getting more into more reception, more relationship, relating with what really is, rather than projecting. It's like the whole, if we're always projecting, like, it's like the whole, if we're always projecting what's not me, or what we're pushing away, or if we're always seeing the world as us, like there's the two things that can happen there. It's like we're just always, we're always seeing something that's either, I think it's me out there, or I'm putting something out there that I definitely cannot never take in as me, so it's definitely on the outside. You're like always projecting something out there, rather than like dissolving that and then just taking in and relating to what is more objectively actually out there. And that's a big question mark from my perspective. So usefulness, I'm wanting to share this as a potential for just encouraging you to continue to learn. Keep your growth mindset. It's just, this is an opportunity for learning. Marie-Louise von Franz, who was a student of Carl Jung's, she wrote, in the realm of the inferior function, there is a great concentration of life, so that as soon as the superior function is worn out, begins to rattle and lose oil like an old car, if people succeed in turning to their inferior function, they will rediscover a new potential for life. Everything in the realm of the inferior function becomes exciting, dramatic, full of positive and negative possibilities. There is tremendous tension, and the world is, as it were, rediscovered through the inferior function. Seems just like a really positive way of framing that. Opportunity for learning. And I was thinking about this whole presentation and there was something that came up about questions. Like there's a big question. I got to the end and I was like, there's a big question mark in me. And I was like, oh, this brings me back to the question mark, the mystery. And then I was thinking about just triplex training. I just wanted to encourage everyone about the mystery of who you are as a person, your triplex, to keep progressing, keep studying yourself, keep learning who you are. And right here, even in the question that was coming up, I was puzzling about this question. I noticed that even right here in this little symbol, the polarities were coming out again. The curve of the question mark, the straight line, the curviness and the straightness. It's kind of the masculine and the feminine, even right there. And then there's the dot, which is in a field of space. It's like polarities, the something and the nothing, or you could say that could be That could be the narrow and the broad. It's like whenever you look around, the images that you see in your experience, in your nighttime dreams, just be curious and puzzling about their polar natures and really just their meaning for you. And it's a question, but it's a question mark. That just brought me to this question of the mark, like the usefulness of all this, of knowing who you are. It comes to like, well, who am I? Where did I come from? What did I learn? What am I learning? And what does it mean? And what do I want to do? What do I want my mark to be in this world, or my marks to be in this world? You know, if this triplex training is about betterment, you know, like, well, if there's something, if for some reason the lopsidedness is, we can work on it, and maybe you do want to have some betterment in that area, what are you going to do with that? What would you like to do with that? What would you like to be your mark to be? So just keep questioning and trusting yourself, trusting your process and what is unfolding, and what you learn from your experiences, even if they just show you what you don't prefer. You can always harvest a learning out of any experience. And I hope that you have harvested a lot of learnings out of the triplex training initial 16-week experience. It would not have happened without you or me, and so much that just led up to this moment. So we really are all connected, and I really appreciate this opportunity, and I love you. I thank you, and yeah, all the blessings and all the things that I could possibly somehow say to convey, which I don't know, maybe just I love you. Oh, I love you. Have a great night, everyone, or a great day whenever you're watching this. Bye for now.